The sun was setting over Oakwood, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple as Officer James Reynolds finished his coffee at Joe's Diner. He'd been coming to this same spot for 15 years, ever since he joined the force. The waitress knew his order by heart: black coffee, 2 sugars, and a slice of apple pie if he was in a good mood. Today wasn't a good mood day. "Rough shift?" asked the older man behind the counter, wiping down the surface with a rag that had seen better days. Reynolds just nodded, his eyes fixed on the local news playing on the small TV in the corner. The reporter was talking about community relations with police, something about building trust. Reynolds scoffed under his breath. "They don't understand what it's like out there," he muttered to no one in particular. Not really. The truth was, Reynolds had once believed in the job. He'd joined the Oakwood Police Department with big dreams about making a difference. His father had been a cop too, back in the day when things were simpler. At least that's how his dad always put it. Reynolds had grown up on stories of good guys catching bad guys, clear lines between right and wrong, but 15 years on the force had left him bitter. The world hadn't matched up to those simple stories. Reynolds had watched younger officers get promoted ahead of him. Twice he'd been passed over for sergeant, positions that went to officers, with half his experience but who knew how to play the game better. The first time it happened, the position went to Officer Chen, who Reynolds privately thought was only selected because the department wanted to show how diverse they were becoming. The second time, just last year, the job went to Officer Wilson, who Reynolds considered too soft on crime in certain neighborhoods. Back at the station, Reynolds kept a mental tally of the officers he thought were getting special treatment. He never said these things out loud anymore, not after the sensitivity training they'd all been forced to attend 3 years ago. But in the privacy of his own thoughts, he nursed these grievances like old wounds that wouldn't heal. His patrol car had become his sanctuary, the place where he could be himself without worrying about who might overhear. On long night shifts, he'd drive through the different neighborhoods of Oakwood and see things through his own particular lens. The East Side, with its big houses and manicured lawns, was where the real citizens lived, the taxpayers who deserved protection. The South Side, with its apartment complexes and corner stores, was where he kept his guard up, where he watched for trouble. Reynolds had a system for who he pulled over. He'd never admit it to anyone, but certain types of cars, certain types of people, got more of his attention. If asked, he'd call it experience or instinct. His supervisor had called him into the office once about his stop statistics, but nothing had come of it. Just a warning to be mindful of appearances. His personal life wasn't much to speak of these days. A divorce 5 years back had left him living alone in a small apartment near the highway. His ex-wife had taken their daughter to live in another state. They talked on the phone sometimes, but the conversations were awkward, filled with long silences. His daughter was in college now, studying something he didn't really understand. Social justice or policy or something that made him uncomfortable when she tried to explain it. The friends he used to have from before the force had drifted away over the years. Now his social circle consisted mainly of a few other officers who shared his views, who understood the job the way he did. They'd get together at Taylor's bar, on weekends, sharing stories and complaints about how the department was changing, how the job wasn't what it used to be. Reynolds finished his coffee and left a few bills on the counter. Outside, the evening air was cool against his face as he walked to his patrol car. He liked the night shift. Less supervision, more freedom to police how he thought was right. His radio crackled as he settled into the driver's seat. The dispatcher was sending units to a disturbance at an apartment complex on Maple Street. Reynolds didn't respond. That wasn't his area tonight, and besides, he had his own plans for the patrol. As he drove through downtown, he noticed how the streets were changing. New businesses with names he couldn't pronounce, signs in languages he didn't understand. When had Oakwood changed so much? He barely recognized parts of it anymore. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from Officer Tanner. "You hear about the big FBI guy coming to town?" Reynolds typed back, "Yeah, some big conference, more talk, less action." The FBI director was coming to Oakwood for some community policing conference. Reynolds had seen the memo but hadn't paid much attention. Just another suit from Washington coming to tell them how to do their jobs, probably never worked a real street patrol in his life. The night stretched ahead of him as he turned onto Somerset Avenue. This was his favorite patrol route, a street that connected the good part of town with the areas he considered problematic. It gave him plenty of opportunities to watch for people who didn't belong. His dashboard computer showed it was just past 9 p.m. The shift had barely started and Reynolds was already counting the hours until it ended. This job had once made him feel powerful, important. Now it just made him tired. He didn't notice the small group of officers gathered around the bulletin board back at the station, looking at the security protocols for the FBI director's visit. He didn't bother reading the full briefing about who would be in town. If he had, he might have seen the photo, might have recognized the face later. But Reynolds had stopped paying attention to the details that didn't interest him years ago. Instead, he focused on the road ahead, on the people walking along the sidewalks making split-second judgments about who might be worth stopping, who might be suspicious. In his mind, he was still a good cop doing what needed to be done, protecting the real Oakwood from those who threatened it. What Reynolds didn't realize was that tonight, his worldview was about to collide with reality in a way he couldn't ignore. In just a few hours, his name would become infamous across the country, and the letters R.A.C.I.S.T would forever be attached to his legacy in law enforcement. The Oakwood Grand Hotel stood tall against the evening sky, its windows glowing with warm light. Inside the main conference room, tables had been arranged in neat rows, each one topped with bottles of water, notepads, and pens bearing the FBI seal. Hotel staff moved quietly around the space, making last-minute adjustments to the sound system and checking that everything was perfect for tomorrow's community policing conference. In Suite 712, FBI Director Anthony Washington was finally alone after a long day of travel and preliminary meetings. At 53, Washington had the kind of face that commanded respect. Deep-set eyes that missed nothing, lines earned through years of difficult decisions, and a calm expression that rarely revealed what he was thinking. He loosened his tie and looked out the window at the city below. Oakwood wasn't big compared to Washington, D.C., but it had been chosen for this conference because it represented the kind of mid-sized American city where new policing approaches could make a real difference. Washington had grown up in a neighborhood where police were viewed with a mixture of respect and wariness. As a child, he'd been taught two sets of rules: how to be a good citizen and how to stay safe during interactions with law enforcement. That second set of lessons had stuck with him through Harvard Law, through his years as a prosecutor, and all the way to his historic appointment as the first black FBI director 3 years ago. His phone buzzed on the desk, a text from his daughter. "Knock 'em dead tomorrow, Dad, love you." He smiled and typed back, "Thanks, baby girl. How's the studying going?" She was in her second year of medical school, following in her mother's footsteps. Washington's wife, Dr. Lynette Washington, was back home in Maryland, running her pediatric practice and probably working late hours just like he was. Another message appeared, this one from his security detail. "All arrangements confirmed. For tomorrow. Car will be ready at 7:30 a.m. Washington sent a quick acknowledgement, then set the phone down. His security team was professional and thorough, sometimes to the point of being stifling. Every movement of his day was planned, every location scouted in advance. It was necessary, he knew that. But sometimes it made him feel like he was living in a bubble, disconnected from the real world. He glanced at the room service menu on the desk, but wasn't really hungry. What he wanted was a walk, some fresh air and movement after being cooped up in cars, planes, and meeting rooms all day. The conference tomorrow was important. 6 months of planning had gone into it, bringing together police departments from across the state to discuss new approaches to community engagement, bias training, and public safety. Washington had made these issues central to his tenure as FBI director. He believed deeply that law enforcement could only succeed when it had the trust of all communities it served. Some of his initiatives had been met with resistance, others with enthusiasm, but he remained committed to the long, difficult work of reform. He changed out of his suit into jeans and a dark blue sweater. He caught his reflection in the mirror, and almost laughed at how different he looked from the official portrait hanging in FBI field offices around the country. Tonight, he wasn't the FBI director. He was just a man who wanted some air and maybe a decent meal that wasn't served. On government China. Washington picked up his phone and credentials. Those never left his person, but left his suit jacket hanging in the closet. His security detail would object to this impromptu outing, which is precisely why he didn't call them. Just one evening of normalcy, that's all he wanted. The hotel hallway was quiet as he made his way to the service elevator. Another trick. He'd learned to avoid being recognized. In the lobby, he kept his head down and walked briskly toward a side exit, nodding politely to a staff member who held the door for him without a second glance. Outside, the spring evening was pleasant, with just enough chill to make his sweater comfortable. Washington took a deep breath of the fresh air and felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. According to his phone, there was a well-reviewed local restaurant just 3 blocks away. Perfect walking distance. As he strolled along the sidewalk, Washington observed the city with professional interest. Oakwood had the usual mix of old and new buildings, local businesses, and chain stores. A group of teenagers laughed outside an ice cream shop. An elderly couple walked hand in hand across the street. Normal life in a normal town, the America that existed outside of Washington's high-pressure world of classified briefings and national security concerns. He passed a bookstore that was still open, its warm lights inviting. Washington paused, tempted to go inside. He was an avid reader when time permitted, which wasn't often these days. Through the window, he could see shelves lined with colorful spines, a few customers browsing quietly. This was the kind of moment he missed, the simple pleasure of looking through books without anyone approaching him about policy questions or budget approvals. But his stomach reminded him of his original mission, so he continued toward the restaurant. Somerset Avenue was well lit and fairly busy for a weeknight. Washington walked with the confident stride that had become second nature after years in positions of authority. He didn't slink or hurry. He simply moved with purpose, observing his surroundings with the trained eye of someone who had spent a lifetime in law enforcement. He noticed a police cruiser driving slowly along the street and felt a momentary twinge of guilt about ditching his security detail. If they discovered he was gone, there would be protocols activated, people called. But surely he could have one meal on his own before anyone realized he was missing. The restaurant was just ahead, its patio filled with diners enjoying the evening. Washington could smell garlic and spices in the air, making him realize how hungry he actually was. Just a quiet dinner, some good food, and then back to the hotel to prepare for tomorrow's conference. He didn't notice the police cruiser that had passed him earlier now making a U-turn at the intersection. Didn't see the officer inside watching, him with narrowed eyes. Washington was thinking about what he might order, mentally rehearsing parts of tomorrow's opening speech, enjoying his brief escape from the constant attention his position usually brought. In that moment, he was just a man walking to dinner, not the FBI director with all the weight and responsibility that title carried. It was exactly what he'd wanted. A slice of normal life, a chance to move through the world unmarked by his title. The illusion would last exactly 2 more minutes, until the sound of a car door slamming behind him brought Washington's moment of freedom to an abrupt and dangerous end. The blue and red lights weren't flashing. Officer Reynolds didn't think he needed them. He watched the man walking along Somerset Avenue, taking in the confident stride, the casual clothes, the way he seemed to be observing everything. Something about it set off alarms in Reynolds's mind. The man didn't seem to belong. Not in this part of town, not at this hour. Reynolds hadn't radioed in, hadn't called for backup. This was the kind of stop he made dozens of times a month, routine, nothing special. He pulled his cruiser alongside the curb and put it in park, eyes never leaving the man on the sidewalk. "You there?" Reynolds called out after pushing his door open. "Hold up a minute." FBI Director Anthony Washington stopped walking. He'd heard that tone before, not directed at him in many years, but he recognized it instantly. The voice of authority expecting immediate compliance. Washington turned slowly toward the police cruiser, his hands naturally moving away from his body, visible and empty. "Good evening, officer," Washington said, his voice steady and respectful. His heart rate had picked up slightly, an instinctive response, but his face remained calm. "Is there a problem?" Reynolds stepped out of his car, one hand resting near his holster, not on it, but close enough that the gesture wasn't lost on Washington. The street lamp cast harsh shadows across the officer's face, making his expression hard to read. "What's your business around here?" Reynolds asked, eyes scanning Washington from head to toe. "Haven't seen you before." A young couple across the street slowed their walking pace, watching the interaction with curious eyes. The woman pulled out her phone, pretending to check messages while actually framing the scene in her camera view. "I'm just heading to dinner," Washington replied, gesturing toward the restaurant visible at the end of the block. "The Oakwood Grill, I believe it's called." "ID," Reynolds said, the word more command than request. He took 2 steps closer, his posture stiff. "Let's see some identification." Washington nodded slowly. "Of course, my wallet is in my back pocket. I'm going to reach for it now if that's all right." Reynolds didn't respond, just watched with narrowed eyes as Washington carefully moved his right hand toward his back pocket. The tension in the air was thick enough to touch. "Actually," Washington said, pausing the movement, "I should mention that I'm Anthony Washington, director of the FBI. I'm in town for the community policing conference. My credentials are in my front pocket if you'd prefer to see those instead." Reynolds' expression changed, surprise flashing across his face before it hardened into something else. Suspicion mixed with disbelief. "Right," he said, his tone making it clear he didn't believe a word. "And I'm the Attorney General. Let's try again. ID now." Across the street, the young woman was no longer pretending. She held her phone up openly now, recording the interaction. Her boyfriend looked nervous, whispering something in her ear that she dismissed with a shake of her head. "I understand your skepticism," Washington said, his voice still calm despite the growing tension. "I'm reaching for my FBI credentials now. They're in my left front pocket." As Washington's hand moved toward his pocket, Reynolds drew his weapon in one fluid motion, pointing it directly at the FBI director's chest. "Hands where I can see them," Reynolds shouted, his voice echoing down the quiet street. "Get your hands up and get on the ground, now!" Washington froze, his hands lifting slowly to shoulder height. He didn't drop to the ground. Instead, he maintained eye contact with Reynolds, his expression somber, but not frightened. "Officer," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that came from years of crisis management. "I'm going to remain standing with my hands visible. I am the director of the FBI, and I would like to resolve this situation peacefully. There are witnesses filming this interaction. Please lower your weapon and I'll slowly show you my credentials." Reynolds' hand tightened around his gun. "I said on the ground." His voice had a slight tremor now, either from adrenaline or anger, maybe both. "Last warning." The young woman recording had been joined by an older man from the restaurant, patio and a taxi driver who had pulled over, all with phones pointed at the scene. In the distance, the wail of a siren could be heard. Someone had called it in. "My name is Anthony Washington," the FBI director repeated, still not moving toward the ground. "I was appointed as FBI director 3 years ago. Before that, I was a federal prosecutor in Maryland. I'm staying at the Oakwood Grand Hotel for the law enforcement conference that begins tomorrow. I understand you're doing your job, but I am not a threat and I am not reaching for a weapon. I am reaching for my credentials." Reynolds' mind was racing, doubt beginning to creep in. Could this actually be the FBI director? But why would he be walking alone at night? Where was his security? It didn't make sense. And if Reynolds was wrong, if this was just some guy trying to talk his way out of a stop. "Don't move," Reynolds ordered, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. He used his free hand to reach for the radio on his shoulder, keeping his gun trained on Washington. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reynolds on Somerset Avenue. I need verification on—" He didn't finish the call. A police cruiser pulled up behind his, lights flashing but siren now silent. The door opened and Sergeant Diane Miller stepped out, taking in the scene with one sweeping glance. Reynolds, with his weapon drawn, the well-dressed black man with his hands raised, the growing crowd of onlookers with their phones recording. "Reynolds," she called sharply. "What's going on here?" Reynolds didn't take his eyes off Washington. "This man claims he's the FBI director. No ID, no security. Found him wandering on Somerset." Miller approached cautiously, her own hand nowhere near her weapon. She looked at Washington, really looked at him, and her expression changed. "Director Washington?" she asked, recognition dawning in her eyes. "Sir, I am so sorry. Are you all right?" The moment stretched like a rubber band pulled to its limit. Reynolds still hadn't lowered his weapon, even as the realization of what was happening, who he was pointing his gun at, began to sink in. 30 seconds passed in complete silence, broken only by the sound of more sirens approaching in the distance. "Officer Reynolds," Miller said, her voice low but commanding, "lower your weapon now." Slowly, as if moving underwater, Reynolds lowered his gun. His face had gone pale, beads of sweat visible on his forehead despite the cool evening air. He holstered his weapon with mechanical precision, years of training taking over where conscious thought had failed him. Washington lowered his hands gradually, his eyes never leaving Reynolds' face. There was no anger in his expression, just a profound weariness and something else. A look that seemed to say, "This is exactly why I'm here. This is why tomorrow's conference matters." "Thank you, Sergeant," Washington said quietly, finally, shifting his gaze to Miller. "I believe we all have a lot to discuss." The crowd of onlookers had grown to nearly 20 people, all watching in silence as the scene unfolded before them. The videos were already being uploaded, shared, spreading across the internet with the speed only a potential scandal can achieve. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was an incident that would reshape lives, policies, and perhaps an entire department. And it had all happened because one officer saw a black man walking alone and decided he didn't belong. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Red and blue lights bounced off storefront windows as 3 more police cruisers pulled onto Somerset Avenue. Officer Reynolds stood frozen, his hand still hovering near, his now holstered weapon, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Sergeant Miller had positioned herself between Reynolds and FBI Director Washington, her body language making it clear who she was protecting. She spoke into her radio, her voice low but urgent. "Cancel the backup call. Situation under control." She paused, then added, "And get Chief Howard on the line. Now." The growing crowd of onlookers had formed a loose semicircle around the scene. Phones remained pointed at the officers, recording every word, every movement. Someone in the back of the crowd was narrating a live video, their hushed voice carrying in the evening air. "And the officer still has not apologized to the FBI. Director, this is happening right now on Somerset Avenue in Oakwood." Washington straightened his sweater, a small gesture that somehow emphasized his dignity in the face of what had just occurred. He finally reached into his pocket and removed his credentials, holding them out not to Reynolds but to Sergeant Miller. "I believe these would have resolved the situation earlier," he said quietly. Miller took the credentials with a respectful nod, glancing at them briefly before handing them back. "Yes, sir, they certainly would have." She turned to Reynolds, her expression hardening. "Officer Reynolds, wait in your vehicle." Reynolds didn't move. His face had gone from pale to flushed, a vein pulsing visibly in his temple. "Sergeant, I was following protocol for suspicious—" "That's enough," Miller cut him off sharply. "We'll discuss protocols later. Right now you need to wait in your vehicle. That's an order." The crowd murmured as Reynolds finally turned and walked stiffly back to his cruiser. One of the newly arrived officers approached, confusion written across his young face as he recognized Washington. "Director Washington?" the young officer asked, disbelief coloring his voice. "Sir, we had no idea you would be out walking." The security briefing said that I would be at the hotel all evening. Washington finished for him. "Yes, that was the plan. I decided to step out for some fresh air and dinner." He glanced at the restaurant at the end of the block, its patio, now empty as all the diners had migrated to the growing crowd. though it seems my dinner plans have changed." Inside his cruiser, Reynolds sat with his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Through the windshield, he could see Miller talking with Washington, her body, language apologetic, professional. He could see the young officer, Anderson, fresh out of the academy, looking at the FBI director with something like awe. He could see the phones still recording, still capturing everything. His career flashed before his eyes. 15 years of service reduced to this one moment. This one terrible mistake that wasn't really a mistake, not in his mind. He had been doing his job. How was he supposed to know who this man was? Walking. Alone at night, no security, no warning to the department. Reynolds' radio crackled to life. "All officers involved in the Somerset Avenue incident, report to headquarters immediately. Repeat, all officers to headquarters." The voice belonged to Chief Patricia Howard. Reynolds closed his eyes briefly. The chief never personally issued orders over the radio. This was bad. This was very bad. Outside, more officers had arrived, forming a protective circle around Washington. An unmarked black SUV pulled up, and two men in suits jumped out, their faces tight with concern and barely controlled anger. "Director," one of them called, moving quickly toward Washington. "Sir, are you all right?" Washington nodded. "I'm fine, Agent Clark, though I believe I owe you and the team an apology for slipping out without notice." The agent's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing profound relief, quickly replaced by determination. "We've secured the perimeter, sir. The car is ready when you are." Washington held up a hand. "In a moment." He turned back to Sergeant Miller. "I'd like to finish our conversation, Sergeant. You were about to tell me about your community outreach program." Miller looked startled, as if she couldn't believe the FBI director wanted to continue their discussion, as if nothing had happened. "Sir, under the circumstances," Washington said firmly, "I think it's more important than ever that we talk about building trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Don't you agree?" Across the street, a local news van had pulled up. A reporter and cameraman were setting up, preparing to broadcast live from the scene. The video taken by bystanders had already begun to spread online, being shared thousands of times in just the few minutes since the confrontation had ended. Reynolds watched it all through his windshield, feeling like he was observing a movie rather than his own life unraveling. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from Officer Tanner. "Dude, is that you on Somerset with the FBI guy? Videos everywhere." He didn't respond. Couldn't respond. What could he possibly say? A tap on his window startled him. Officer Anderson stood there, his young face serious. "Reynolds, Chief wants us back at the station now. I'm supposed to drive with you." Reynolds nodded numbly and slid over to the passenger seat. As Anderson got behind the wheel, Reynolds caught a final glimpse of the scene. Washington, now surrounded by his security detail, speaking calmly with Miller and two other officers, the crowd still watching, recording, witnessing. The drive back to the station was silent. Anderson kept his eyes on the road, his hands at precisely 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. The young officer didn't ask questions, didn't offer platitudes, didn't say anything at all. The silence felt like an accusation. At headquarters, the atmosphere was electric. Officers huddled in small groups, conversation stopping abruptly when Reynolds and Anderson walked in. Chief Howard stood in the doorway of her office, her expression impossible to read. "Reynolds," she called, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "My office. Now." He walked the longest 30 feet of his life, feeling the eyes of every officer on him. Inside the chief's office, Deputy Chief Thomas was already waiting, along with someone from Internal Affairs. Rodriguez, a by-the-book officer who had investigated excessive force complaints for the past decade. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded like the final nail in a coffin. "Sit down, Officer Reynolds," Chief Howard said, her voice carefully controlled. Reynolds sat. On the chief's computer screen, he could see the video, one of the videos, playing silently. His own face looked back at him, gun drawn, pointed at the man now known to be the FBI director. "Explain," the chief said simply. Reynolds opened his mouth, then closed it again. What could he say that wouldn't sound like an excuse? That wouldn't reveal thoughts he'd kept hidden for years? Outside the office, phones continued to buzz with notifications as the video spread further, faster. The story was no longer just local. It had gone national in a matter of minutes. The hashtag was already trending. Racist cop. Morning light filtered through the blinds of Chief Patricia Howard's office, casting stripes across her desk where a stack of newspapers lay. Every front page showed the same image: Officer Reynolds pointing his gun at FBI Director Washington. The headlines varied, but the story was the same. Chief Howard had been up all night. The circles under her eyes told of emergency meetings, phone calls with the mayor, and an official statement hastily prepared in the early morning hours. Her coffee had gone cold, forgotten during yet another call. This one with the FBI's regional office. "Yes, I understand the seriousness," she said into the phone, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "The officer has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation." She paused, listening. Yes, I'll be making a public statement at 10 a.m. As she hung up, there was a knock at her door. "Come in," she called, straightening in her chair. Deputy Chief Thomas entered, his face grave. "The press is already gathering outside, at least 6 news vans and social media." He shook his head. "It's everywhere, Chief." Howard nodded. She'd seen the numbers. The video had been viewed over 2 million times overnight. The hashtag "the racist cop" was trending nationally. The department's phones hadn't stopped ringing since midnight. "What about Reynolds?" she asked. "At home. His union rep advised him not to speak to anyone. We've had to put a patrol car outside his apartment. He's received threats." Howard rubbed her temples. "And Director Washington?" "Still in town. His office issued a statement calling for calm and a thorough investigation. He's still planning to open the conference this morning." Thomas hesitated. "He's requested a meeting with you beforehand." Of course he had. Howard checked her watch, 7:30 a.m. Just enough time to prepare. "Set it up," she said. "And Thomas, pull Reynolds' complete file. Every complaint, every commendation, every performance review. Everything." "Already done," Thomas said, placing a thick folder on her desk. "You'll want to look at pages 17 through 22. Complaint patterns that never quite rose to the level of action." Howard's eyes narrowed. "Patterns? Disproportionate stops of minority drivers, excessive force complaints that were dismissed due to lack of evidence. Nothing that stuck, but enough to show a history." Howard finished, her heart sinking. Why wasn't this flagged before? Thomas's silence was answer enough. It had been flagged, just not prioritized, not addressed. The weight of that institutional failure settled on Howard's shoulders alongside the immediate crisis. Across town, in a small apartment filled with boxes that had never been unpacked despite 5 years of residence, Officer James Reynolds sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone. The screen was filled with notifications, text messages, news alerts, emails. He'd stopped reading them hours ago. His dress uniform hung on the back of the door, pressed and ready for a day of work that wouldn't come. His badge and gun had been surrendered the night before, taken by Rodriguez from Internal Affairs with a formal receipt and a cold expression. Reynolds had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same scene playing out, but differently. In some versions, he recognized Washington immediately and simply nodded a greeting. In others, the confrontation escalated further, ending in unthinkable tragedy. Reality lay somewhere between these extremes, but reality was bad enough. His phone buzzed again, another text from Tanner. "They're saying it'll be on national news tonight. You okay?" Reynolds didn't respond. Was he okay? No, not even close. Everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for was crumbling around him. And for what? Following his instincts? Doing what any officer would do when seeing someone suspicious? But even as he formed the thought, he knew it wasn't true. Not every officer would have done what he did. Not every officer would have drawn their weapon on an unarmed man who was calmly offering identification. Not every officer would have seen Washington as suspicious in the first place. Reynolds stood up and moved to the window, careful to stay behind the blinds. The patrol car was still outside. Protection or surveillance, he wasn't sure which. Probably both. His phone rang. His ex-wife. She'd already called 3 times since last night. He let it go to voicemail again. What could he possibly say to her? To their daughter, who was probably watching all this unfold online, seeing her father become the face of everything she stood against? At the Oakwood Grand Hotel, FBI Director Anthony Washington adjusted his tie as his security team briefed him on the day's revised schedule. "We've added additional security throughout the venue," Agent Clark was saying. "All attendees will go through metal detectors, and we've coordinated with local police for perimeter control." Washington nodded, only half listening. His mind was still on the previous night's events, not on what had happened to him, but on what it represented. The conference today was meant to address exactly these issues, but now the stakes felt higher, the need more immediate. "And your meeting with Chief Howard is set for 9 a.m., Clark continued. "We've cleared the route and secured the room." "Thank you," Washington said, turning from the mirror to face his team. "I want to make something clear before we proceed. Last night's incident is to be referenced only as necessary for security purposes. This is not about me or that particular officer. This is about patterns and systems. Am I understood?" The agents nodded, though their expressions suggested they didn't entirely agree. To them, someone had pointed a gun at their director. It was personal, and it was serious. But Washington had spent his career looking beyond individual incidents to the larger picture. One officer with a gun was a problem. A system that created and protected such officers was a crisis. At 10 a.m. precisely, Chief Howard stood before a forest of microphones on the steps of the Oakwood Police Department. Camera flashes exploded like lightning as she approached the podium, her uniform crisp, her expression resolute. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying across the crowd of reporters and onlookers. "Last night, an incident occurred involving one of our officers and FBI Director Anthony Washington. The video of this incident has been widely shared, and I know many of you have seen it." She paused, looking directly into the cameras. "I want to be absolutely clear. What occurred last night does not represent the values of the Oakwood Police Department. It does not reflect our training or our expectations of how officers interact with any member of our community." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. "Officer James Reynolds has been placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. As of this morning, following a preliminary review of the incident and Officer Reynolds' service record, he has been terminated from the Oakwood Police Department." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Termination so quickly was unusual, practically unheard of. This decision was not made lightly, but it was necessary. The review revealed a pattern of behavior inconsistent with our department's standards and values. "We cannot and will not tolerate any actions by our officers that undermine public trust or safety," Howard continued, outlining additional steps. "A department-wide review of stop procedures, enhanced bias training, community listening sessions." Her words were strong, decisive, but they couldn't erase what had happened. In his apartment, Reynolds watched the press conference on his laptop, his face blank as he heard his 15-year career ended in a single sentence. He'd expected suspension, an investigation that might drag on for months. Not this. Not immediate. Termination. His phone rang again, his union representative this time. Reynolds answered mechanically. "I just saw," he said before the rep could speak. "Can they do that? Without a full investigation?" The explanation that followed was full of legal terms and procedures, but the essence was clear enough. The department could do it. The video was damning. The preliminary review of his record had revealed enough to justify immediate action. The union would fight, but the chances of reinstatement were slim to none. As the call ended, Reynolds sat in silence, the weight of his new reality settling around him. No job, no badge. his name and face known nationwide for all the wrong reasons. On his laptop screen, the press conference had ended, replaced by a live feed from the Community Policing Conference. FBI Director Washington was at the podium now, his demeanor composed as he addressed the room full of officers from departments across the state. "What happened last night," Washington was saying, "is precisely why we are all here today. It is a stark reminder of the work we still have to do, not just in training and procedures, but in changing the culture of law enforcement from the inside out." Reynolds closed the laptop sharply, unable to listen anymore. He moved to the window again, looking out at the street below where the patrol car still sat. Beyond it, he could see normal life continuing. People walking dogs, heading to work, living their lives untouched by the destruction of his. 6 months later, on a crisp fall afternoon, a new class of recruits stood at attention outside the Oakwood Police Academy. Their faces reflected the diversity of the community they would serve, a deliberate effort by the department following the Reynolds incident and the changes it had sparked. Chief Howard moved along the line, inspecting each recruit, pausing to make eye contact, to see the individuals who would soon wear the